I would almost consider this as EOC 3.0. We had a 1.0, which was prior to 9/11, and then a 2.0 and restructuring of emergency management post 9/11. And I think that this has really been a strong turning point in how we conduct business, or how local jurisdictions conduct business in emergency management and in communications. And I think that this is really our 3.0 and trying to gauge how we can do things better in the future.
Welcome to the Smart Talk series, the show for professionals who want strategies, tips, and real talk about all things PR, marketing, and social media. Your host is Melissa Vela-Williamson, an award-winning, accredited, and nationally recognized PR pro and communication thought leader. And now your host, Melissa Vela-Williamson.
Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Smart Talk series. I'm Melissa Vela-Williamson. Today, I'm joined by Michael Morlan. Michael is an emergency management contractor consultant, mentor, emergency management strategist, and president of Two Rivers Emergency Management. From growing up in the Midwest, working in the hustle and bustle of the city that never sleeps, living in the sunny beaches of Florida, and now a resident of the Lone Star State, Michael has been across the nation perfecting strategies in an effort to redefine emergency management. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you for having me.
So, Michael, tell us a little bit more about your background and your current role.
Sure. So I've been in emergency management for over 10 years now, and started actually quite young, and have worked all over the country in the federal level and local level, and now at the contract level, working with primarily local governments and tribal governments to ensure that they're more prepared for major emergencies and disasters. I'm currently the president of Two Rivers Emergency Management. We were established in 2016. We have been working in about 11 different states. Our primary focus is mostly middle of the country. We stay away from the coasts, but we primarily deal with the Midwest and the southern states, and working with the emergency preparedness, mostly planning related items for the government.
So you said you started early. Was there something in particular that drew you into emergency planning, or how does one find themselves in there after school?
Coming right out of high school, I actually joined a fire department, and I was working in the fire service for about 3 years. My father was actually in emergency management at the government level, the local government. That's kind of what sparked my interest in emergency management. I told him always growing up that I wanted to go work for FEMA, and that was actually one of my first EM jobs, was working for FEMA, primarily working Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Irene, which had brought me to New York City and, weirdly enough, actually Los Angeles. I've worked on both sides of the country and worked FEMA just for a little while before moving over to the local sector.
Wow. Okay. Starting from there makes all the sense in the world. Absolutely. Our audience is made up of a lot of communication professionals, a lot of PR pros, and we often hear about crisis communications in public relations, but not as much about emergency preparedness or management. Why is emergency planning very important?
The planning aspect of it, and I'll be frank with you, is most of the time when people develop the plans, when the emergency happens or the disaster happens, chances are they're too busy to actually read the plan to figure out what was in it. So really, the goal of the process is going through the motions of doing the planning and making sure that you guys are having open conversations with your stakeholders, your partners, trying to develop agreements in advance for services, whatever that may be. It's more about the process than it is the end document. And that's one of the things that we try to shoot for with our clients, is focusing on what can we get from this process, and not a document that you're referencing. Of course, we want to make sure that documents are a part of the process in terms of response and recovery, but those can be more of we found more benefit in having checklists than we have had wordy documents that are hard to reference during an incident. So that's one of the things, I think is really important. It's more of trying to figure out how you can respond and, more importantly, how you can actually recover from an incident.
Absolutely. I agree with you on so many levels there. I think in crisis communication planning, what I have seen the same thing. It's those checklists, the things that you actually can apply quickly at the end that have a lot of value. For me, it is also about writing the what if scenarios, going through that process, like you said, and having those uncomfortable conversations so that the things that keep people up secretly at night are on the table and can be thought about. And I really appreciate your side of the industry, because I've always said the communication comes after the actions. And so I'm so glad that you're going to walk us through some of the things that you think about in terms of what are the right actions to take, because communicators, we're worried about the messaging of those actions, but I actually can't tell you what we need to do in those emergency situations. So that's fantastic. You know, the pandemic, I think for a lot of communication professionals, opened our eyes to the reality of crisis can happen at any moment. And it's not really if a crisis would happen, it's more about when something happens. But this has been just phenomenal for everyone. How has your organization or your clients been impacted by the pandemic? And has COVID changed your approach on how you do your work?
COVID was a horrible thing to obviously happen to our country, our world, our nation. But at the same point, it has afforded us an opportunity to test things and realize some of the gaps that we have in our processes that are focused on more all hazards and not necessarily a tornado or a hurricane or things like that. Jurisdictions have had to involve a lot of different stakeholders into the process that they typically hadn't involved in previously. And this has really been able to hopefully be a turning point in a lot of lessons learned in emergency management. And I wrote a brief article early on in COVID about emergency operations centers. And if you're not familiar with those are primarily where emergency managers kind of help coordinate incidents and disasters, trying to get the right resources to the right location and making sure all of those pieces fit together. And I would almost consider this as EOC 3.0. We had a 1.0, which was prior to 9/11. And then a 2.0 and restructuring of emergency management post 9/11. And I think that this has really been a strong turning point in how we conduct business, or how local jurisdictions conduct business in emergency management and in communications. And I think that this is really our 3.0 and trying to gauge how we can do things better in the future. So our clients have seen a wide range of struggles, improvements, lessons learned. And, you know, one of the things that many local jurisdictions weren't equipped for were 1 year of continuous incident activation. Now they're used to smaller activations, maybe for a week or 2 weeks at a time, or even shorter than that. But for staff that typically have other day-to-day duties and having to focus on a continuous response to COVID and then all of the other incidents within COVID, hurricanes, winter storm, there's many other things that have happened during this that have really tested our capabilities as our clients are concerned. And so it's really trying to focus on some of those and trying to help them navigate those waters and how we can be better prepared for the future. And I can tell you, recovery is a huge piece of that, and trying to ensure that our local governments are more prepared, not only financially, and that goes back to citizen preparedness as well. Financial is a huge piece of it that they often don't talk about, and trying to make sure that we've got adequate staffing for some of these incidents, and maybe a bit of restructuring. You see that oftentimes after a major disaster is an organization restructure, trying to focus on better allocating resources. And I think that this is going to be that step. For us, we primarily have been working remotely even prior to COVID. Our focus, since we've started since 2016. And so we're not super new, but we're still fairly new enough to where I'm still a little bit uneasy as to if you always have to be prepared if that next contract's not going to come in or that next invoice isn't going to come in. And so we really have tried to focus and model our business after what we preach. And that's been kind of preparing for the what ifs. And our what if is, what if tomorrow we don't have any more contracts? The chances of that are fairly slim, but that is a possibility. And so we've primarily been trying to focus and structure our business to the what ifs. A brick and mortar makes sense for some people, but we've been able to focus and working with our clients virtually. We have been starting to do some in-person things and traveling a little bit, but primarily we've been able to transition into virtual meetings and even meetings that are tangible. I think that that's huge, is trying to turn a meeting to not just meet, but to actually get something from it. And we've been able to transition that to virtual. And we've been trying to be as resilient as possible prior to COVID. But as far as our business is concerned, it's been almost business as usual, just based off of our model. It's just trying to mold our process around our client's process. And they have definitely had to change. Government has been focused on meeting after meeting after meeting in person. You can't go an entire day without potentially meetings all day long and not getting actually any work done. And I think that they've been able to transition a lot of that into meaningful work and virtual meetings that have allowed them to be more progressive and proactive.
I agree with so much of that, Michael. I know that when I started my business, MVW Communications, in 2015, one of the strategies was being remote from clients, was being more resilient by not having that high overhead, like you mentioned. But just a little bit of space has allowed me to do deeper work. And now that with the pandemic, a lot of offices had to go remote, there is more of a thoughtful process around meetings. I love to meet, like you said, in the work session style. We're there to get something accomplished and done. And so I love that resiliency that you have had in your model and how you're helping others think through that as well, because you hit on that right. Recovery is going to be huge. My term for the year and my theme of this series is all about that, communicating in turbulent times and restoration and recovery. And this is not a healed year. We're going to be working on our recovery for quite a while. Correct. Well, great. That was a great explanation of a lot of major updates and changes in processes and in the mindset around the work because of this sustained type of crisis and issues management. But so many communicators, they've definitely realized that they should have planned for an emergency. Maybe they hadn't before. Even a pandemic, right, prior to 2020. What differences did you see in those who had planned for this type of emergency versus those who had not?
It's tough because this isn't a typical incident that most government or private sector agencies plan for. And, the government sector, and we work, obviously that's our primary focus is the government sector. And they have done a lot of pre-planning for bits and pieces of responding to a pandemic. A good case in point are medical countermeasures or strategic stockpile for vaccinations and medical supplies. But as you saw, when it's more widespread, the chances of significant pre-planning kind of goes out the window a little bit. That was seen early on when they had a shortage of personal protective equipment. And it's quite interesting, as we see the pandemic, progress down the road. Early on, I remember the experts telling everybody to not wear a mask. The masks are for the medical professionals. And you see how quickly we've transitioned to wear your mask. That's the only way that we're going to stop this, right? And I think a lot of that has to do with our supply chain. And supply chain management is huge. And that was definitely seen here in Texas during the winter storm. The supply chain was broken. And there's not a whole lot we can do without the supply chain. And that goes from electricity to gas to food and water to early on in COVID, toilet paper. When we have these incidents and they're so widespread, it's much harder to pre-plan for some of those items. I was listening to a gentleman I look up to about emergency management, and he was stating that the federal government on the FEMA side is sort of in an identity crisis. They've been full throttle since prior to, I would say, probably around Hurricane Harvey. So you see how long ago that was. Hurricane Harvey, stretched the resources to the Gulf Coast, and they've been nonstop. And this has been a change from focusing on hurricanes to pandemic response to the crisis at the border. Those are typical things that FEMA had not been involved in the past. And so emergency management, even at the local level, has been involved in a lot of these different processes and has been full throttle. And this goes back to my 3.0 is trying to identify what their identity is going to be. What is going to be their mission? Because I can tell you, as a country, as local jurisdictions, oftentimes, since we haven't really dealt with pandemics, many times it's just checking a box. Every year, if they have a plan requirement, or maybe it's every 5 years or something of that nature for grants or federal or state requirements, most of the time, because they haven't been able to exercise it, the latest was prior to this was maybe a focus on Ebola or H1N1. And that really has created a gap in how we respond. It's really imperative that we take a step back, we look at the whole picture, maybe do a hard reset, and focus on what the important pieces of our pre-planning is, and trying to exercise those things frequently. I think it's vitally important that we try to reimagine what we could do better. I think planning is going to be part of that process. So in short, I think that there is a lot of gaps in our response or government's response to the pandemic. But I think that there's a lot of room for improvement I wouldn't say it's a catastrophic failure, but it is an opportunity.
I think everyone's kind of having an identity crisis, or at least an evaluation of their purpose and where they fit in this ecosystem now. I'm seeing this from communication professionals. Michael, for me, in my vantage point, I come to all communication with that public relations point of view. It's certainly my expertise. It's where my heart lives as well, because it's so people focused. And it is focused on the realities and the what ifs of our lives, so we can communicate well about them. But I did find that during the pandemic, those who were trained and familiar with crisis communication were even more important in our industry, because they could help navigate all the uncertainty and lead the way with clients. For me, though, I think back on conversations I've had with you previously about emergency planning, and I just can't help but wonder what communication pros without that knowledge, what they were doing and how they've persevered through this. So from your standpoint, how can communicators work with emergency planners better?
I'm aware of the difference between the two, and they're definitely two different pieces of contracting or consulting, and have really been separate. And your firm's not the first one I've spoken with before. And our realm is almost very similar. It's interesting because as you're aware, and shameless plug, I'm from San Antonio, during the winter storm, there was a lot of gaps in potentially communication, right, to the public. You see that throughout every incident. Whenever a incident happens or an exercise happens, that's a drill or something, normally the number one issue that comes from that is always communication. And it's really trying to focus on how we can better communicate response and recovery, especially on the public sector, to citizens. And this goes hand in hand with a lot of different incidents. And I've seen a lot of work done, studies done on incidents and, challenges with, for example, dealing with or trying to communicate with those with access and functional needs. And that has always been, especially at a smaller jurisdiction that doesn't have the resources, is always a challenge. But it doesn't exclude us from needing to actually prepare for those things. And I would argue that they have an obligation to still prepare for those things. And that's really where we can try to work together as crisis communicators, as emergency management consultants, emergency planners, of how we can better communicate our strategies, our focuses. The government has always been, almost try to be secret squirrel about things, but it's really that we need to be more transparent. We need to be transparent on what the expectations are of the general public, what they can expect from the public sector. And not only that, but how can the public sector communicate to the private sector on how can they better respond? How can they respond to getting their trucks into their grocery stores so that they can restock the shelves when there's been a massive flood in the city? That was definitely seen during Hurricane Harvey in Houston. And trying to get the supply chain back up and running, because that's the private sector. And so really this comes full circle, as I always talk about the 3 C's, which is communication, coordination, and collaboration. And so those are the 3 C's that we try to focus on with emergency management. And as you see, communication is part of that. And trying to focus on how can we better communicate with everybody, all of our partners, our stakeholders. And so things aren't assumed. That's one of the things we see personally, maybe within our own personal lives, is you don't want to assume, you want to verify. So is the information verified or is it unverified? And that's really the focus that we need to go towards, is working with collaboratively, I would say, with crisis communicators like yourself, and trying to enhance these plans. I'm not an expert crisis communicator, but I can sure tell you how to run an EOC. But you, as a crisis communicator, may better be able to tell us how to run a joint information center, for example, how the public information officers can come together and try to have joint messaging. Those are some of the pieces I think that we as emergency management consultants and crisis communicators can work together for future collaboration.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. I love your 3 C's. Thank you for pointing those out. Of those, I would say my view of what's been happening over the course of many, many months now has been a big gap in that chain. A big gap in the strategies has been collaboration. Because the communication, you will find the right messages to share when groups are collaborating and sharing information across the aisle, across the departments, across the industry sectors, and coming together to share that information, and then finding the way forward through the messaging tends to be easy after that. But it is that collaborative mindset and piece that I often see missing. This head in the sand, we don't want to talk about it approach does not help anyone, particularly in a crisis. So very important to point out there. So in your line of work, it's kind of a joke with crisis communicators that we would definitely like to have done the work with an organization to plan for these scenarios and write out our response templates, at least something that can be tailored before an incident happens. But do you find yourself coming in to clean up a mess after, or plan to prevent them with a client?
So I can tell you that in most of our cases, we're trying to do pre-incident planning. However, I can tell you most planning is conducted based off of post-incident. I think we're trying to gear for the next one, but we are coming from, an incident that provided some additional lessons learned and best practices. And that's kind of what we're basing our planning off of. So, a good example of this is a client we worked with had a hurricane go through their jurisdiction, and their political structure decided that we needed to revamp all of their planning documents, how the organization was structured, and just really hit that reset button. And this was before COVID too. And so we really provided some program management expertise in trying to help them recover from the disaster, but make them ready for the next one. So I would argue that most of our planning is because of an incident, but before the next one.
That sounds very typical. We realize we need something when there is an incident often, and that's just very organic for human behavior, I would say. So it makes a lot of sense, but they're so much stronger after going through that work with you all, as I'm sure they are after going through that response and recovery and efforts with crisis communicators. So perfectly said.
I would be lying here if I said that some jurisdictions will, try to hire a contractor or a consultant just to, check a box that they don't have time for. A good example of this actually is mitigation planning. Across the country, mitigation planning is required for local jurisdictions to receive FEMA dollars. And so they have to have that plan updated every 5 years. And the challenge we see with this is it's an important piece of the puzzle and how a jurisdiction can be more prepared or how they can mitigate certain things to prevent or lessen the impacts of future incidents. But most of the time, due to the process, it's not as heavily engaged, or they don't get the buy-in that they need it to be successful. And so most of the time, the jurisdictions are usually hiring maybe a contractor. Now, I won't speak for everybody. I think that there are jurisdictions out there who are really trying to push the envelope. But there are jurisdictions who just need to check the box to say that they have an approved mitigation plan. And that's not the way that we need to be planning for future incidents. We need to be deliberate in our information. We don't need to just do it to do it. And I think that that's one of the things we try to preach and we talk to the clients is trying to change the way that we do planning and not focus on checking a box for a requirement, but what can be tailored to the jurisdiction to enhance that planning. That's one of the things that I try to discuss with our clients is we understand that the state or the federal government may have a template, but let's do better than their template and be deliberate with how we're going to go forward as an organization and not just try to create a document just to create the document.
I think that's so important. What I've heard so much this last year is so many can'ts. We can't do this. We can't do that. And my mantra has been the opposite. Like, let's talk about what we can do. Let's meet people in their actual reality. Let's meet the public where their sentiment actually lies. To your point, let's build our plans in the reality you actually face versus just working within some guardrails template that we have. There are ways to honor those boundaries, but make strong, dynamic plans and strategies and tactics that serve it better from where you're at in the community. Absolutely. So, Michael, you've talked about a lot of really important things today. Is there one thing you'd want our communication professionals to take away from your vantage point?
The one thing I'd like to just try to reiterate is trying to get into the process. I think that emergency planning or business continuity has really been, for some businesses or even some clients from the government sector, is the difficulty in conducting the process. And I think that the process is the most important part. Like I mentioned earlier, it's not maybe the end result of the document in hand, but more of coming together with your partners and stakeholders to try and identify and meet face to face before a disaster happens, and trying to focus on how we can communicate better together during an incident, how we can respond together, how can we recover together as a whole community, and focus on more of the process. You have to start somewhere. And I think that starting somewhere is starting that communication, that discussion with those stakeholders and partners to how can we do things better as an organization. And I think that's the starting point. So, because we see it over and over again, people don't want to jump into it, especially when you're a smaller jurisdiction or a smaller business. They don't want to start into the process. They think it's too troublesome or cumbersome. And we really just want to reiterate that it's more about the process than the end result.
Yes, absolutely. Moving forward together, going through that process together and collaborating during that journey is going to be very key to recovery for sure. And being prepared for our next incident, crisis, absolutely. So, Michael, I'd like to ask everyone, especially someone as smart as you, what does smart talk mean to Michael Morlan?
So smart talk to me would mean a thought-provoking conversation, one that maybe has tangible results and is an open, collaborative, stage to be able to have a discussion that allows for a better way forward and more thought-provoking.
Perfectly said. Very smart. Thank you. So, Michael, what you do is very important for our industry, but also for our country. What is the best way for us to learn more about you or your work?
So to learn more about us, we do have a brief website over at tworiversem.com. There you'll find some additional information about our contractors, our consultants, what it takes to become one, to work for us, in some of our clients and projects that we are currently working on or have worked on in the past. That's about it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and insights with us today, Michael.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks to our listeners for joining us for today's episode. Before I let you go, I wanted to share some exciting news. For years, I couldn't find any communication swag. No cool mugs, shirts, or stickers that show we have pride in our profession. So we made some of our own. Check out prgearshop.com for promo gear designed by PR and communication pros for pros. That's prgearshop.com for promo gear designed by pros for pros. And as always, think smart and communicate smart. And I'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Smart Talk series. If you learned something or enjoyed our conversation, share it on social media or send to a friend. To learn more about this and other communication topics, visit mvw360.com. That's mvw360.com.